Happy Wednesday, everyone. My name is Yilin Zhuang. I'm the Water Resources Regional Specialized Agent in University of Florida IFAS Extension. Welcome to the Water Wednesdays. Water Wednesdays is a webinar series about Florida's precious resource, water. Every Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, we live stream a 30-minute talk about Florida's water and what we can do to protect it. We host our webinar series on Zoom and broadcast to Facebook Live. We have a theme for every month. October is the Agriculture Best Management Practices Month. November, we focus on Florida Spring. This month, we focus on urban agriculture. Today not only marks the last Water Wednesday talk for Urban Agriculture Month, but also marks the last Water Wednesday for this year. You may recall in last Water Wednesday, Ms. Hannah mentioned hydroponics is one of the growing needs in urban agriculture. Today, I invited my colleague, Dr. Morgan Pinkerton, the Sustainable Agriculture and Food System Agent in Seminole County, to give us a quick overview of hydroponics. Now let's welcome Dr. Pinkerton.
So hello everyone, welcome. Just bear with me 1 second while I get my presentation here shared. Okay, so welcome again. I'm going to go over the basics of hydroponics today. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what are hydroponics and why we would even bother using hydroponics in the first place. And then we'll also talk about ways where we can try out hydroponics in our own home or backyard. So to start off, the term hydroponics is a very simple term. It just is broken down, hydro meaning water and ponics meaning labor. So I like to think of our plants doing work in water. And this word is derived from Greek and these two terms here. And you can see a picture here of a very simple hydroponics garden setup. So hydroponics can be as complex as we make it out to be, or it can be fairly simple and use very few resources and be affordable to start it out on our own. So basically, hydroponics, as I've alluded to already, is a method of growing plants in which we use water, and it's a method of growing plants without soil. So our water is a mixture of nutrients and water, and this is how our plants get what they need. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but basically we could have a hydroponic system where we're growing plants directly in water, or we might be growing them in an inert media like perlite, cocoa fibers, or some others. And we'll get more about into this later. So I do want to give you a brief overview of the history of hydroponics. Though it might seem like a term that is fancy and really technologically advanced, hydroponics have been around for a really long time. So our first instance of hydroponics was actually recorded all the way back in 600 BC. And this was with the hanging gardens seen in one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world in Babylon. And then more recently than that, in 13 AD, we have records of our hydroponic systems being used with our floating gardens. The Aztecs used these floating gardens called chinampas, and they basically were in this large lake, and they were able to produce flowers and vegetables on these moving rafts throughout the lake. It was first documented by the Spaniards, but this was a method that they really used well in this area, and it worked for the muck soils that were in the area that they were producing these chinampas. And then in the 1850s, that is about when we started to see more of our advanced technologies that we think of as hydroponics today. So Julius von Sachs was a professor at the University of Würzburg, and he developed our first nutrient solution that dissolved in water. So up until this point in time, we were using solid nutrient forms. So when we think of our very basic forms of nutrients for plants, we can potentially think about using cow manure to fertilize our plants. But around the 1850s is when we really start to see the use of our solutions, our nutrient solutions, and that's why he was termed the father of water culture. And in the 1930s, that's when the actual term hydroponics was first coined. And Frederick Garrick from the University of California was the guy that really coined this term. And originally he thought he would call it aquaculture. And then he quickly realized that aquaculture was the term used for raising marine organisms. So for example, like keeping fish in tanks. And so then he led to this term hydroponics, as we already described, meaning labor of water. And he used a nutriculture laboratory in the university that he eventually began to produce commercial crops. And there's newspapers that cite it as having these giant tomato plants up to 25 feet tall in a building using water only to produce them. And hydroponics were used throughout history since the day this term was coined. And in 1945, and basically throughout World War II, we see the use of hydroponics to feed our troops. So both US and British armies used hydroponics to produce fresh produce to feed our troops. One of the more notable and successful areas where they did this was on Ascension Island. And you can see a picture of that here, where they produced lots of fruits and veggies to supply the troops during the war. In 1948, this is when we have our movement towards modern hydroponics. And Emory Emmerich from the University of Kentucky, he was considered the father of plastics in agriculture. And so he was the first person to start using plastics in agriculture, from things like greenhouse covers to tunnels to soil mulches. And as we see in our hydroponic systems today, this is where we use a lot of plastics, because up until this point, hydroponics were a very, very large investment to build the structures needed to keep plants in a hydroponic system, because a lot of this was made of concrete and metal piping and things like this. But after the introduction of plastics into the system and into the use of hydroponics, it became a lot easier for people to have hydroponically grown plants. And then we basically get into the 1950s and beyond up until today, where we have had an explosion of botanical research. And this is not just limited to hydroponics. It's in all plant production, including agriculture, where we have a lot of new technologies, and we're continuing to come out with a lot of really cool things today. But in this time frame, we're also seeing a lot of really cool hydroponic systems and a lot more research going into producing plants hydroponically. And we'll get into a little bit later about why we care to have hydroponics. But let's start with how hydroponics work. So to understand how hydroponics work, we do want to review what plants need to grow. So if we think back to our very basic science classes where we talked about how plants survive, we think about the things that they need. And so they need air, including carbon dioxide. They need water, or H2O. They need light, or essentially energy. And then they also need soil. And I put in parentheses, or nutrients, because we'll talk more about this in a second. So plants photosynthesize, and basically what this means is they take the water and carbon dioxide, and using the energy they are getting from light, they're able to produce their own sugars and oxygen. So in humans, we aren't able to produce our own sugars the way plants do. So we actually consume our sugar. That's why we eat plants, and that's why we eat food, whereas our plants are really truly amazing in that they can produce their own food from the process of photosynthesis. So we look at these key steps here where we need carbon dioxide, we need water, we need that light energy, and then out comes sugar and oxygen. I had mentioned that the soil is important for our plants, and the soil is important for a few different reasons. Within our soil, we have water, we have essential nutrients, and then that soil also gives a structure for our plant to hold on to. So the important things, like I've already mentioned, is we have our water, and then we have our nutrients, and this includes our macronutrients and our micronutrients. So there are 17 essential nutrients, and all of these are required for plants to be able to grow and survive. Our macronutrients are things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and things the plants need in very large quantities. And our micronutrients are things the plant need, but not quite as in large of quantities. So just small amounts are all they need to produce and to grow. And I also mention here that the soil is important for pH. And pH is essentially a measure of how acidic the soil is. So we have our hydrogen ions floating in the soil solution, and this is what is contributing to the pH. pH is really important when we look at the uptake of different macro and micronutrients. So if the roots are in the soil, they are responsible for taking in those nutrients, and the pH really play a role into the root's ability to take up those nutrients. So in a normal planting system, the plants get their nutrients from the soil, the air, and the water. But a lot of that comes from the soil, and that's where the plant has its structure, it's where it's standing and where it'll stay. Because unlike people, plants just don't get up and walk away. In our hydroponic system, our plants will get nutrients from the air again, but also from water, and our water is a nutrient solution. So with our soil, the soil can release nutrients, and the soil has a water solution in it that contains more nutrients. But in our hydroponic system, we just have water. And so we're really able to control really well the nutrients going into our system. So what does a basic hydroponic system look like? Well, first and foremost, you have your plant, because that's the whole reason we have the hydroponic system. And then we have our container. And our container is what provides that structure that the soil would otherwise provide. So this is what's holding our plant upright and keeping it in its location. And so our containers can be very, very diverse. We see a lot of different containers, but in the basic, most simplest system, we just have a container that is holding that nutrient solution. And then we get to our nutrient solution, and that is basically just water, and it contains all the nutrients that the plant needs to survive. And all of it's contained in this water solution because it doesn't have the soil or anywhere else to get it from. And then, as we mentioned, we can have our hydroponics system directly in water or in an inert medium. And in our inert media, this could contain things like rock wool, grow rock, cocoa fibers, vermiculite, oasis cubes. There's a lot of different medias we can use. And it really depends on our setup of whether or not we would be using an inert media. And so these are broken down into both organic or inorganic forms, and some might be better for certain setups. So if you have something that has a pump on it, which we'll look at more, you want to be careful of using your organic media that can kind of just like fall apart and get stuck in our pumps and clog our tubes. And for some situations, you want to pay attention to your inert media as well, because our organic media, they can start to break down. So they can get bacteria in them that can cause them to smell. And if we're having our hydroponic system within our house or in a room where we regularly frequent, we want to make sure that we're using things that aren't going to be smelly and bothersome. So you can use your more inorganic inert medias like oasis cubes, perlite, and more. And then in our hydroponic system, we do have a lot of freedom with the light. So we could very well put our hydroponic system outside, and we can use natural sunlight to get that light energy for the plants to be able to photosynthesize. But with some more advanced systems, we can actually modify the light. So if we have our hydroponics set up inside where there isn't sunlight available, we're able to add artificial lights with our grow lights and even set them up on a timer to behave just like the sun setting every day. So now I'm going to go over some of the different kinds of hydroponic systems that we can see. And these are with some really great graphics we have here from No Soil Solutions. And to start off, I want to talk about deep water culture, which is what's pictured here on the left. These are where our plants are directly in a nutrient solution. And then I want to mention here, in all of our hydroponic systems, we need to make sure that our plants are able to get air to the roots. If we don't get air to the roots can start to break down because they do need small amount of oxygens for nutrient uptake and for breaking down those sugars that they collect. But they don't, you want to make sure your roots are getting water, but leaving a little bit of air so that they don't get rot, don't get breakdown from being in an anaerobic environment where there is no air. So this deep water culture can work really well for larger plants with our large root systems, but it can be used for a lot of different types of plants. So you can have this where you set up an air stone or an air pump that allows air to be bubbled in and making sure your roots are getting air. Or you could do this a little bit more passively, and we'll talk more about this method when we get into ways to try it at home. But there is the crack key method in which we allow the roots to have air by giving space between where the roots begin and where the roots enter into our nutrient solution. But essentially with our deep water culture, we have our plant up on top, the roots are sticking in our nutrient solution, and we make sure we have a source of air. With our wick hydroponic system, this is a little bit more passive in which we don't need to have an air pump or any other system unless we have lights or something like that attached. But as far as electronics, there's nothing else we need. And then with our wick system, we have a really absorbent medium that draws that water up into the area where the plant roots are. And so this tends to work pretty well for our herbs. And I've even seen these in like a mason jar where it's just a single plant and you have the wicks bringing up that nutrient solution. So the nutrients along with water up to the root zone of the plant. So this is really nice for if you have window plants or a really small area to try out your hydroponic systems. So getting into some more complex systems here, we have our nutrient film technique. And this is basically where we have a separate holding tank for our nutrient solution and water. And then we have channels essentially that have a slight slope. And so the water can flow down this channel. We have a water pump that's pumping that nutrient solution to the top of the channel, and it then flows down to the bottom of the channel. Along the way here, the roots are picking up any nutrients and water it needs. And then the remainder of the nutrient solution that the plant isn't using glides along this channel out to a drop that then allows the leftover nutrient solution to go back into our holding tank and be recycled. So this system works really well for leafy greens, and it's a great way to reuse our water and reuse our nutrients. So another awesome thing about the nutrient film technique is it's really easy to upscale your production. So this is one of the more common methods that we see used for commercial hydroponic production because we can have these really long channels that have lots of different plants on them. So we have a lot of plants growing at the same time, and then we can have a single tank supplying many, many channels with nutrient solution. Our ebb and flow system is kind of similar. We call this our flood and drain system. And this is essentially, we have a water pump again that's pumping that water up to an area where our plants are. Within this area where the plants are, we do have an inert media that's kind of holding the moisture in that area because the water is not going to be there the entire time. So when the water is turned on, we can set this up with a timer to make it automatic. When the water's turned on, it floods this area where the plants are. The plants are able to take up water and nutrients. And then we have a system set up here so that this container never overflows. So you pump in water, and then any excess above that limit, that maximum height we want the water to reach, will just go back into our tank. When the timer shuts off, all of the nutrients in here is going to flush back down into our nutrient solution holding tank. And so again, a good way to recycle the water and provide the plants what they need. Then we have two systems here, drip and irrigation, drip and aeroponics. With our drip system, this is kind of similar with what we saw with our nutrient film technique, except we are supplying a small amount of water at a time instead of running water through an entire channel. But in this, we again have our water pump pumping water into the area where the roots are, and it's going to either slowly drip out constantly, or it might drip out a little bit at a time, shut off, and then turn back on with a more automated system. So once the roots are really well saturated with nutrient solution, it'll just begin to naturally drop off. And our container here collects all that drop and following liquid, and then it returns back down, drains into our nutrient tank. So this could, like I said, either be slowly dripping or kind of like our ebb and flow system where it's a little bit of water added at once and then it stops and then it'll kick back on again. With aeroponics, kind of a similar setup to our drip, except we're using a mist of nutrient solution. So with this really, really tiny mist, it might allow the plants to take up nutrient a little bit better and to take up that water a little bit better, applying small amounts at a time. But again, as seen with our drip system, we have the roots will eventually become saturated and any leftover liquid will just drop off along with any leftover nutrients. And then it's back in our tank where it's recycled as it's pumped back to be misting the plants. And then I also want to mention aquaponics here. So very commonly I get questions on hydroponics, and then I realize that people are actually talking about aquaponics system. So aquaponics is basically the combination of hydroponics and aquaculture. So if you remember when I talked about the history of hydroponics, aquaculture was where we are actually taking care of marine organisms like fish. And then hydroponics, as we know, we're using a system other than soil, using a nutrient-based solution in order to produce our plants. But with our aquaponics, what we have is we feed our fish and then our fish excrete waste. So like what we see with cow manure, fish waste can also be a really great fertilizer for our plants. So when the fish eat, they excrete waste. This waste mixed in with the water, because this is a very soluble waste, then goes up into the zone where the plants are. It's pumped up that way, and then our plants take up nutrients. It takes up the water it needs, and then our now much cleaner water is then filtered back into the area where the fish are. So a little bit more complex of a system because you're including both plants and fish that you have to take care of. So why do we use hydroponics? Well, to understand why we would use hydroponics, we have to get into the use of space. And so by 2050, our population is estimated to increase from 7.7 billion people to 9.7 billion. So that's a huge increase of the amount of people. And with that, we also see the development of land for housing and for more urban areas. Currently, about 40% of the land in the world is used for agriculture, but every year we are seeing the conversion of this land, and it's being developed, as I mentioned, for more urban or suburban purposes. And so close to our urban areas, we're seeing less and less farmland, or it's shrinking over time. But we have a growing population that we need to feed. So with hydroponics, we are able to better use the space available to us. And that's because of some of the cool technology in our hydroponic setups. So we're able to use 80% less space to produce the same amount of food as in traditional growing systems. So for every 1 acre we would have in hydroponics, that would mean we need 5 acres in traditional plant growing space to produce that same amount of food. And one of the reasons for this is because with hydroponics, we don't have to just plant in a flat system on the ground. We can build upwards. And we saw a picture a while back of a vertical system of hydroponics. So really cool stuff. where you can kind of change the way we're using the space, more efficiently using that space as a resource and making sure that the plants have enough space to grow out and are getting enough light with the available space. And also, we can use what would otherwise be non-arable land. So we can plant plants using hydroponics in an area that isn't really suitable for growing plants. So for example, the soil might not just be good soil for growing plants, like the structure of it may be poor, there's not a whole lot of nutrients or resources, so plants just don't grow well on it. So thinking like a desert where there's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of nutrients, so not a lot of plants will grow well there. And then we also can have food production in more urban areas. So if any of you are from a very urban area, you know that the green space is very limited. And we need a lot of space to be able to produce food traditionally, where we're planting them in the ground and in the soil. So with hydroponics, we're able to have farms and have food production within these urban areas in more localized and concentrated environments. And hydroponics, we also have to talk about water use because, believe it or not, hydroponics is actually more efficient in its use of water. And water is a very limited resource. And as our population continues to grow over time, so will that demand for water. And not just for consumption and production of food, but also for households like washing dishes and showering, and every time you have to water the lawn. And today, 1 in 3 people in the world still don't have safe access to drinking water. So it is a very important and precious resource, and we need to make sure that we're not only conserving what we have, but protecting it from pollution. And so along that lines, most people are unaware of how much water they use on a daily basis, but also a lot of water goes into the production of food. So in hydroponic systems, about 95% less water is used. And I know it seems like, well, the whole basis of hydroponics is using water. Well, as I mentioned before, we're doing a lot of recycling and reusing water. So we're really efficiently using it. So that's like saying for every 1 bucket of water, we have 20 buckets of water needed to grow the same amount of food in our traditional planting systems. So hydroponics are definitely a way we can look at conserving our water resources. On the line of conserving water, we also conserve fertilizer. So as we're using our hydroponic system, it's a very closed and regulated system. So we're constantly recycling what doesn't get used, putting it back into our plant system, and having a very easy way to control what fertilizers are going into it. With our traditional plant growing, we have the environment. And so every time we apply fertilizer, there's a chance that that fertilizer goes out of the range where the roots can reach it. So if it starts to rain really hard after applying fertilizer, it might get moved by the water and the plants won't actually get to use it. That being said, sometimes soil can hold on to nutrients. So there's certain nutrients that once they're in the soil just holds on to it too tightly for the plant to be able to take it up. So in hydroponics, we eliminate that as a factor. So the soil doesn't hold on to our nutrients. And so we're not losing nutrients to our planting system, to our soil, and having it, again, move outside of our very open system. Then another cool thing to mention is that we can reduce the amount of time it takes to harvest our plants by using hydroponic systems. And especially when we're in a closed system where we have it indoors, where we can control temperature, we can control the light, and all these other conditions to an absolute T, this can optimize the plant growing conditions and make them grow fastest. And so it is something to consider that we can harvest faster and produce the same amount of food in a shorter amount of time by using these hydroponic systems. Also, with the unique nature of hydroponic systems, we don't have soil. And so that means we don't really have a place for pests like weeds to interrupt our system. And weeds are basically any plant that's in our growing system that essentially can steal nutrients, they can steal water, or they can block our desirable plants from getting light. And so a lot of times, one of the number one things we're controlling for in our traditional growing systems is weeds, and we use a lot of herbicides in addition to other things to do this. So by reducing the amount of weeds, we can eliminate the need for herbicides. And the same is true when we're working in a very closed system. We can focus on preventing pest problems and preventing them from getting into our system. So kind of like we prevent, for example, wildlife from getting into our houses, we can prevent pests from getting into our hydroponic systems when they're indoors. But there are some caveats with hydroponic systems. It's not just as simple as, okay, let's start growing all of our food hydroponically. There really is an upfront cost for the equipment, and some of these setups can get really, really complex. So for our more automated system that includes lights and includes timers and all sorts of pumps, you are going to be it's going to be a little bit more difficult. They're a little bit more costly to set up, and there is some technical knowledge. So if you're trying to do this on a large scale at a large farm, it's going to require quite a bit of engineering to make sure your system is ideal in preventing any problems you could have in growing your plants. So again, it's not as easy as let's just grow everything hydroponically. And then, as I already mentioned, we can reduce some needs for pesticides by prevention of pest problems, but we also have a lot of work and effort that goes into hydroponic systems for sanitation, care, and prevention of problems. So just like our plants in a normal system in a traditional growing system can be affected by insects, arthropods, and then other diseases, pathogens like viruses, fungi, and bacteria. We need to be very, very careful not to introduce these into our system, because if our system is closed, they'll start to thrive once they're in our environment. So we have to do a lot of preventative maintenance of our hydroponic systems and preventative cleaning in between each time we have plants in the system. So now I want to talk a little bit about how you can try hydroponics at home. Because personally, after reading so much about hydroponics, all of a sudden I want to plant everything in water in my windowsill. So a really easy and affordable way to do this, as I mentioned, some of these systems can get really complex and costly. This one is super affordable, and you can try it out on a small scale inside your backyard before you work up to more complex systems in hydroponics. So with this, our set it and forget it lettuce method, you can have fresh lettuce grown in your own backyard using hydroponic systems in about 6 to 8 weeks. So really quick growing time, and you can also have some beautiful plants as you see here. So what do you need to set up one of these systems? And all of this would be readily available from your local hardware store. So a 5-gallon bucket with a lid, these like paint buckets that you can get from a hardware store. You need pH strips. We mentioned that pH plays a role in the ability of the plants to uptake nutrients. So we need to make sure that our nutrient solution in our hydroponic system is at the right pH for our plants. And then grow cubes. You can see in the picture here, we have rock wool growing cubes, and this is what we're going to put our plants and our seeds into. We need our 2-inch net cups pictured here down in the bottom corner. And these again are helping to prop up our plant, and we'll put our rock wool inside of this. We need our hydroponic nutrients, which is basically a nutrient solution that dissolves well in water. And then white vinegar, which we can use to lower that pH and adjust it to make sure it's the right pH range for our plants. So for our hydroponic lettuce, that's about 5.5 to 6.5 for our pH. And then we need a teaspoon measure. That's going to be for measuring out our nutrients in our vinegar, and then a stir to make sure we mix it all up before we introduce plants. And of course, we need our lettuce seeds, which will start out. You can start directly in the bucket, or you can start them in the grow cubes in a small Tupperware. And then, of course, we need water for our hydroponic system. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I just wanted to mention that it is really easy to try this at home. So specifically for lettuce, there are some varieties that work well hydroponically. So we might choose something like a bib lettuce or a butterhead lettuce, something like that. But it really depends on the crop, but this would be a great way to start off in an affordable way to try out hydroponics before you think about more complex systems. So if you are interested in more information about the set it and forget it lettuce, you can see a video here, and I'll go ahead and post this into the chat when we're done here as well. So this is a video by my colleague Hannah Wooten, and for those of you that joined us last week, she also gave a talk about urban agriculture, but she did this great video, less than 10 minutes, on how to set up that set it and forget it lettuce in your own backyard. There's also a great resource if you want to jump right into a hydroponic floating garden. So you can grow more than the 3 plants we see in our set it and forget it lettuce. There's a great resource listed here. Again, I will post these into the chat. And then if you are looking to do hydroponics on a larger scale and looking into starting your own farm someday, I suggest looking at the Small Farms website. There's specifically a bunch of really great resources for hydroponics. So with that, that is all I have. It's a really brief and rapid overview of hydroponics, and with some resources for if you want to try these at home. So I think I have one question in the chat here. Do you use a bell siphon or some other type of drain from the ebb and flow? So that is not a question I know how to answer right off the bat, but I can look up more information about that and get back to you, because I believe we have your email, or you can go ahead and send me an email specifically with that question to morgan0402@ufl.edu, and I can do some reading and get back to you on that. Does anyone else have any questions for me? All right. Well, I thank you all for joining me today. So let's see. We have a question. Do the IFAS links say what plants do well? Yes, so some of those links will tell you what specific plants will work well, especially for our hydroponic floating garden. It will recommend some plants, but you can use, there's definitely tomatoes will go well hydroponically depending on the variety. Herbs do well, and a lot of our leafy greens really, really do well in hydroponic systems. So if you're first starting out, I would recommend trying out lettuce and other leafy greens first. We also have a question about light, direct or shady. So that is highly dependent on the plant. So there are certain plants that need direct sunlight, and then there's other plants that would need less sunlight. So when you're selecting what you're going to be planting hydroponically, it's just like you would select a plant to go out in the ground. So if you have an area where you're going to set up a hydroponic system that is very, very sunny, you should specifically select plants that do well in full sun. All right. And yes, let me stop my share here and make sure that those links get posted into the chat so that everyone can access them. All right.
Hi. Hi, sorry for some accident. So my computer just froze for about 2 minutes. I couldn't do anything. Now it's back to normal. I see Morgan already posted some links here, and I'm posting the evaluation link. So if we will appreciate if you can take the survey, take this evaluation survey, tell us what you have learned and how we can improve that. And then now I'm looking at the Facebook page because my computer is finally working. I can see. So we have a couple questions here. Let me check. Do you have a direct water source or just a reservoir?
So depending on the system that you have set up, you're going to want to have a reservoir so that you can control the amount of nutrients that's going into your system. So if you're starting out really small, you can just use tap water to start out. And then, like I talked about, you would need to adjust the pH of the water and add the nutrients using your vinegar and then your nutrient solution. So it's not a constant flow of water into your system. You're really recycling that water from a nutrient holding tank. And then that's how it becomes a very water efficient and nutrient efficient system, because we're recycling what the plants don't use, putting them through our tank where they're held, and then putting them back into our plant system. Thanks. I'm looking to see, do we have any more questions on Facebook?
Facebook, there's another question. It's about the recordings. So yes, you will find the recordings. It's on my YouTube channel, which you can find the link from the description. I will also post it in the chat box, so it will be easier to find the link. So I think that's the question so far for Facebook. Oh, excuse me. Oh yes, for Facebook. And I'm
it
also
looks like we got one more here in the chat on Zoom. How can we test the nutrients? So with our nutrients, there are some fancy equipment that we can use to test our nutrients, but basically when you're first setting up a hydroponic system, you want to follow the label that's on your nutrients. So every nutrients is going to be different. So for some, it might be, for example, a teaspoon of nutrients per gallon of water. But there are specific equipment that you can buy if this is something that's going to become a hobby, where you can really easily test nitrogen levels and test a lot of the macronutrients, the ones your plants need a lot of, to make sure they're getting enough. But really starting off, making sure that you're putting the right amount into your system, and then you can monitor over time. So if it rains and your system's outside, this is going to add more water and it might not be as concentrated of nutrients. So you want to keep track of how much it's raining to know how much water got added into your hydroponic system. And really, there's a lot of specifics depending on what kind of setup you have for nutrients as well. I've actually taken a whole class that I've been working on lately just on nutrient management and hydroponic system, because it can get pretty complex. But if you're starting off with a basic at-home system, starting small, just follow the label of the nutrients.
And we have another question on Zoom. So I'm not sure if you can see it, Morgan. It's about, can we possible to incorporate beneficial organism in the nutrient solution for hydroponics?
So I was reading earlier this morning that sometimes you will introduce some more beneficial bacteria into the system, but I can't speak to a lot of it. It's kind of one of those things that once you get into a hobby of it, there's not a whole lot of good extension material either on beneficial organisms in hydroponic systems. So I think a lot of it right now is just kind of trial and error and seeing what works for you. If you have a very simple system, just start with different experiments. I specifically have someone in our county that's just been trying all sorts of new things and just seeing what works for her setup specifically. So we have a question, would I use the same water-soluble fertilizer I use for my houseplants? So if you look more into the set it and forget it lettuce method, you will see that basically any water-soluble fertilizer will work. You just want to make sure it's the right nutrients for the plant. So there are some water-soluble fertilizers that are designed more specifically for different plants. So it might be specifically for tomatoes. You wouldn't want to use this for other plants. But your water-soluble fertilizers, just your standard ones, can work to start off with your lettuce. Right.
Thank you, Morgan. I think you covered most questions. Before I let everyone go, especially for our Facebook viewers, I also post a link on the chat box. And if you like our Water Wednesday series, please like us and tell your friends about our wonderful webinar series. We really look forward to connecting with you on the digital platforms. I think that covers all the questions for today. Again, if you have any questions, you can always email me, or like if you are viewing it on Facebook, you can just put in the chat box. We will. I will get a question to Morgan and get an answer back to you. I saw some questions it's asking about the certificate for this webinar series, because this is very informal webinar talk. We don't have any certificate. If you want any like just a written document saying you attended that, please email me. I will put my email address in the chat box. So just email me your request. I can give you some informal written document. And with that, I thank you for your time and hope you all have a wonderful holiday season and see you in 2021. Bye, everyone.
Bye.